Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the podcast titled When Wildfire Comes. My name is Dr. Christopher Potter, and I'm a wildfire scientist with over 30 years of experience working for NASA, that's our nation's space agency, and also with local communities impacted by wildland fires. I've studied wildfire on the urban interface of our communities using satellite imagery and ground measurements for really all the most destructive fires in the Western United States. And I've published dozens of science papers on these events. I myself live in a high risk wildfire zone in Northern California, so right in the midst of it all during the fire season, which now seems to last most of our year here in California. But today we're very lucky, privileged to hear from our invited guest, Dr. Daniel Swain, about some of the science behind the occurrence and the spread of increasing the massive wildfires in the Western United States, including many of their impacts on our metropolitan areas and communities. So, just a little background for Dr. Swain. He's a climate scientist and he focuses very much on the dynamics of extreme weather events, including droughts, storms, and today, particularly, we're going to talk about wildfires. He presently holds an appointment as a climate scientist and associate researcher in the California Institute for Water Resources and with the University of California. Um, without further ado, Daniel, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for being with us. And would you like to add anything to that little bio that I
I
just
think
gave?
you've covered it pretty well. Thanks for having me. And
Sure,
I'm glad we're at least able to have this conversation at a moment during a quiet fire period. Granted, it is the middle of winter, so one might hope that would be the case in California in February, but won't take anything for granted these days.
that's for sure. Last in January in 2025, that was not the case. So it definitely had some of these biggest fires in Southern California happened during those winter months. So, but right now, yes, it seems to be pretty calm weather-wise, and you do a very popular, widely read weather West blog. Is that right? Give you that little promo, weatherwest.com. Is that still the place to go?
Yeah. I write the Weather West blog, which is at weatherwest.com. And more recently, I've started to do essentially virtual weather and climate office hours on YouTube at the Weather West YouTube channel. And in some ways, that's turned into the even more real-time version of this because many of those live streams have been during major wildfire events in recent years and sort of
Mm-hmm.
walking people through in some cases hour by hour as they unfold. So it's an interesting intersection of science, communication, technology, and the evolving world around us. So you
Yeah,
can find me there as well.
that's cool. Is that something you stay up all night doing when the
Uh,
events come?
Occasionally, when there's a really high impact fire or other event, I will sometimes be on there for more hours than not. And so sometimes the news networks will actually carry the live stream for during their fire coverage, which is always a little bit of a bewildering moment because sometimes
Yeah,
I'm carrying their coverage and commenting on it, and then I kind of mirrors over. So
yeah,
strange world we live in these days, but I think there's real demand for, by the public, by people who are affected by fires to understand better what's happening, both in real time as they unfold for obvious reasons. In some cases, it really affects, whether you stay or leave even, but in the medium to long term, the kind of conversation we're having today, about why things are changing and sort of not just why things are changing, but why fires behave the way they do in the moment as well.
yeah, for sure. It's an evolving science. Lots of new things to learn, new technologies to bring to bear. When you're doing your live cast, um, where do you get your like live feeds? Who do you depend on to get like video or um, just pictures of what's happening on the event you're looking at?
Well, I think one of the reasons why it draws such an audience is I really do try to bring together a lot of different sources. So some objective data-driven sources, a lot of which are actually remote sensing from NASA and NOAA, so satellite imagery,
Hmm.
weather radar imagery. Unfortunately, with intense fires near populated areas can be useful as well because that has a pretty strong signature when they're burning intensely. Those are two really useful um, objective platforms to sort of know where the fire is and how quickly it's spreading and sort of get a sense of how it's behaving, including whether it's producing these kinds of more exotic behaviors we're going to talk about today. We can get some indication of that from the essentially quasi real time. I mean, we're talking updated within a matter of minutes,
Yeah.
satellite and radar imagery. And then there's also the more qualitative sources. So I'm sort of integrating information from social media, from the app called Watch Duty, which I'm not affiliated with, but I will pitch it as a really useful tool for those who live in wildfire prone areas as a good resource for real-time information. I was actually initially a skeptic of any private entity company app that would sort of supplant public sources for real-time information, but that is in fact what has happened, and it is probably the single best source if you're going to
Hmm.
look in one spot for it. So the Watch Duty app is another thing that I'm sort of commenting on. And then there is, like the live news coverage. Some of it is, a lot of the news agencies now fly, especially during daytime, helicopters around and get these live views of fires. And sometimes I'll walk people through, what you're seeing, what we're seeing on screen, whether it's the local ABC or NBC affiliate or something, and these, when the fire's making an uphill run, talking about the behavior of the head of the fire, or when it zooms out and you can see the full smoke plume, commenting on the atmospheric dynamics and the coupling, whether there's a pyrocumulus or pyrocumulonimbus cloud involved and what that means. So, kind of a range of sources, all the way from sort of the raw data to the weather information, to the visual imagery, to the social media reports, trying to bring it all together.
Yeah. Yeah. Can you remind us again how to tune into that?
Well, those live streams are always on YouTube at the Weather West channel. So I
Okay.
know a lot of folks sometimes subscribe to the channel to get notified when I go live. But also, I'm pretty uh, overly available on other social media channels as well, and I'll always announce there when I'm about to go live. So the folks who follow me on these other channels usually get a sense of when that's about to happen. But all of this is on the Weather West YouTube channel.
Okay. Great. That's perfect. Oh, that's great. Yeah. So, yeah, I know when the helicopters are flying around, that they can't get too close, right, to the fire because the firefighters themselves are flying their own aircraft. So, and that's become that's become a bit of an issue, hasn't it, with even drones flying near Cal Fire equipment
Yeah,
and
usually
interfering.
the news helicopters in these events will be much higher and farther away than it appears. They have great zoom lenses on their cameras, so they're usually at a considerable distance and also at an elevation that's in controlled airspace that's deliberately not in the flight path of the firefighting aircraft or fixed wing or helicopters that are in the area. Rises when there are folks who send up those personal drones and they're in those, the lowest 1,000 feet near a fire. I mean, that's exactly where a lot of these firefighting aircraft are present at really lower than usual altitudes, and it can really interfere with the firefight because often what will happen is if there's an unauthorized drone and they can't control where it's moving, there's a real threat that either a fixed wing aircraft or a helicopter could essentially crash into it, and that could lead to really bad outcomes. So they will shut down firefighting aviation temporarily until they can confirm that drone is down and out of the area. So it's actually it's treated as a pretty serious criminal offense these days, and for understandable reasons. So don't do it. The news helicopters
Yeah.
are coordinating with air traffic control and firefighting aircraft, and they're in a much safer, more controlled location than any of your personal drones are going to be.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's great. great thing to remind the public of, just because you want to get a scoop on your Instagram post that's not worth it. You can result in the fire spreading, getting out of control, burning down towns nearby if the firefighters can't get up there and do what they got to do. So yeah, hey, let's talk a little bit about these pyrocumulus events, these pyrocumulus fire clouds, because I know you posted some amazing commentary and analysis on them. And uh, what do you think is the main set of conditions that lead to uh, the those cumulus clouds, those that are literally coming from the fire itself, developing, forming, and then becoming, so tall, so high in elevation. What are those conditions that usually you have to see?
Yeah, so there really is this emerging field of essentially dynamic fire weather. And increasingly over the years, obviously it's long been recognized that wildfire and weather conditions are related and that there are certain weather conditions that can produce active or extreme wildfire behavior. Some of the obvious stuff is if it's really hot, really dry, and really windy, you pick two, and that's enough for a very active fire. If vegetation is sufficiently dry, pick three, and you're in a really bad spot potentially. But there's also another dimension to fire weather that isn't just a factor of how hot, dry, or windy it is at the ground level. It's also a function of the vertical structure of the atmosphere, and in particular, the stability, or rather lack thereof, in that vertical profile of temperature and moisture. And if you've ever lived or grown up in or visited a place that sees more regular thunderstorms than is often the case in most of California. Coastal California has some of the lowest frequency of thunderstorms of almost anywhere on Earth, save for Antarctica, believe it or not. But uh, when you have those puffy afternoon cumulus clouds, those cauliflower-like clouds, um,
Mhm.
cumuliform clouds, as they're called collectively, those clouds are formed when sort of random thermals in the atmosphere, the same thermals that you might see large birds of prey gliding upon, or in some cases in California coast ranges, people on their gliders, hang gliders, for example, or ultralight aircraft take advantage of these too. Essentially, the process of convection in the atmosphere, where these warm thermals, these bubbles of air rise because warm air under the surface is less dense. And so it's like just think of it like a bubble in your carbonated beverage rising through the drink to the top of the drink.
Mhm.
That's sort of what's happening in the atmosphere. So these cumulus clouds build on the thermals, and if the air is moist enough, and if the temperatures decrease quickly enough with height, that rising thermal can reach its condensation level, so sort of where that cumulus cloud starts to form. And then, if the atmosphere is sufficiently unstable, it keeps rising into a much taller cumulus cloud. So first, it might become a towering cumulus cloud, and those are usually fairly unthreatening clouds. They can produce isolated showers, but not much more than that. But if these clouds keep growing, they'll grow into what's known as a cumulonimbus cloud, which is sort of the king of the cloud kingdom, if you will,
Mhm.
because they're very large and they can produce some of the most extreme weather on Earth. And they also tend to be the very tallest clouds that exist. So they can be 30, 40, even 50,000 feet tall. So we're talking in some cases close to twice the cruising altitude of a commercial airliner, the tops of these clouds. So these are actually clouds that
Mhm.
commercial airliners will usually try to avoid by going around them because it's actually not always possible to go above them. Um,
That's remarkable.
and so they're essentially thunderstorm clouds. Cumulonimbus are thunderstorm clouds. And they only occur when the atmosphere is particularly unstable. So not just a little bit unstable, but you need to have an atmosphere that is buoyant enough in the lower levels that these rising parcels of air can keep rising for tens and tens of thousands of feet. That self-sustaining um, buoyancy comes partly from the fact that once you get into the cloud, obviously there's condensed water vapor, and that's what you see as the cloud.
Mhm.
And now the air is cooling inside the cloud at a slower rate than its surroundings. So outside the cloud, the temperatures decrease rapidly with height, but inside the cloud, they still decrease with height, but more slowly, which once again makes it even more buoyant. So there's a self-reinforcing process. The cloud keeps growing by virtue of itself growing. So a self-reinforcing feedback.
Hmm.
That's a typical thunderstorm. The reason why I've given this mini meteorology lesson is the same thing can happen on top of wildfires, and these would be known as pyrocumulus for somewhat lesser clouds or pyrocumulonimbus clouds. Essentially, these are fire-generated cumulus or fire-generated thunderstorm clouds. And they occur under conditions that are somewhat similar to what their non-fire related counterparts would be. The atmosphere has to be sufficiently moist and unstable in the low levels to be reasonably receptive to producing these kinds of clouds. But the big asterisk, the big difference is that sometimes the fire itself makes the atmosphere significantly more unstable. So as you can imagine, if you have a fairly large fire at ground level that's burning at hundreds, even over 1,000 degrees, depending on how intense the fire is, that essentially acts as a very intense localized heat source that can make the lower atmosphere really, really unstable. So you can produce these kinds of clouds even in environments that wouldn't have necessarily produced a towering cumulus or a thunderstorm cloud, but for the relatively extreme surface perturbation that this fire offers. It just is localized convection plume that makes the atmosphere really unstable right on top of the fire. And so you need both a fire, a localized extreme heat source at the surface, but you also need favorable atmospheric conditions, at least reasonably unstable, moist atmosphere. You won't get a pyrocumulonimbus cloud, even if there's a very intense fire, if there's no atmospheric potential instability. And so the pyrocumulonimbus cloud isn't always a sign of an extremely intense fire. You can get a pretty robust pyrocumulus cloud even on top of a modest fire if the atmosphere was already really favorable for cumulus clouds.
Hmm.
But there is a relationship where the stronger the fire, given a sufficiently unstable atmosphere, the larger, hotter the fire, the more likely it's going to produce a really big pyrocumulonimbus cloud. And once it does, that cloud can go on to intensify the fire itself. So that we'll talk a little bit more about how that happens in a moment. But that's essentially the basic science on why these kind of clouds form in the first place.
Yeah, that it's kind of um, confusing to anybody who doesn't understand all the meteorology and the physics because we think about fire weather as extremely low humidity near the surface, right? I mean, that is probably the one thing that is the best predictor of a large fire is that it's been very low humidity for a long time. The fuel's all dried out, but then you're saying yet above it, there needs to be relatively high humidity on that day when when the pyrocumulus cloud can form. Is that right?
Well, and this is where the difference between absolute and relative humidity comes into play. So,
Ah.
for example, if it's 100 degrees and humidity is 30%, there's actually vastly more water vapor in the air in absolute terms, if you were to actually measure the mass of it, than 30% relative humidity at 70 degrees. So even though the humidity in relative terms might be low, there can actually be quite a bit of moisture in the atmosphere. So that's one reason why there's a little bit of a difference. The other thing too is that the fire itself, if it's burning a lot of biomass, a lot of carbon, fire is a combustion reaction. One of the byproducts is in fact water vapor. So some of the water vapor in the fire, it's from the fire itself, is contributing to the water vapor in the pyrocumulonimbus cloud. So the fire is not only lending instability in the form of a localized heat source, but it's also lending instability by actually increasing the localized humidity just above the fire where the cloud would be forming. And so a really large, high intensity fire is actually adding a lot of water vapor to the local atmosphere, enough that it can essentially produce a storm cloud under the right conditions.
Yeah, that makes now that makes perfect sense. Yep. The vegetation, even though it is dry, it's alive and it's transpiring water to stay alive. And so a big fir tree or um, even a large chaparral can be evaporating a lot of water on any given day. And it's moist, even though because it's alive still, so, and doing what it's doing. But this is all great. So when that big cloud forms above an intense fire, um, what are the various dangers or risk factors that start to form? Are we talking about uh, local ember transport or large scale processes start to take over?
It's both, and it depends on the conditions and sort of the scale of the cloud. So maybe we'll start out with the lesser ones and go all the way up to the really big exotic stuff that can
Hmm.
happen. Any pyrocumulus cloud it suggests that there is some level of sustained updraft above the fire, meaning that there is sort of a chimney effect where hot material, including mostly smoke, but if the fire is really intense, embers, so actual potential firebrands being um, sufficiently hot material, often smoldering or even, glowing things that are actually on fire. And sometimes, in an extreme event, these can be as large as half a foot across. Usually we're talking more like fractions of an inch, but in a really intense updraft, you can get twigs and leaves and even small branches that get lofted by these updrafts in these convection columns, and they can make it up, in a more typical fire, hundreds of feet, in the air, maybe a couple thousand feet, and then, they can blow horizontally and then fall out well ahead of the fire front. That's known as sort of medium distance spotting, where a fire can sort of jump ahead of itself by lofting these embers, blowing them a bit horizontally, and then landing well ahead of where the main fire front is, starting new spot fires and advancing the fire that way. But in a really extreme example, some of these embers can be ingested into the convection column um, thousands or even tens of thousands of feet above the ground. Because again, these pyrocumulonimbus clouds, at their most extreme, can be 30, 40,000 feet tall.
Hmm.
And these embers then, because the winds aloft are always going to be stronger really than the surface, they can transport these embers, especially if they're larger, a considerable distance, sometimes more than a couple of miles downwind. There are some reports of embers being transported 5, 10 miles ahead of the fire front under more extreme circumstances. That's not the norm, but that would be extreme long range spotting. And we have seen this in a number of California wildfires in recent years, where
Hmm.
these convection columns, cause new spot fires miles downwind. So that's one thing that
Amazing.
can happen that causes the fire to spot ahead of itself and can be dangerous. But there's some other, risk factors that emerge as well, which is that when you get a really extreme convection column, let's call it the pyrocumulonimbus, the more dramatic version of this with a, cloud top 25, 30, even 40,000 feet tall in the case of the most extreme events. Uh, these pyrocumulonimbus clouds, they are literally fire generated storms. They can produce lightning, cloud to ground lightning, which can be an even more unusual way for a fire to spark new fires even miles away. So, cloud to ground lightning strikes are, of course, under ordinary circumstances, that's one way to spark a wildfire. You can get to the point where the fire is generating such a sufficiently intense storm cloud above it that it actually is starting new fires through generating its own lightning. And again, we've seen that in many cases in recent Western US and California fires. The other
Yeah.
thing that can happen is these pyrocumulonimbus clouds can develop um, various wind patterns that help to reinforce the intensity of the fire as well and spread it even faster by doing things like causing air to rush inward from all directions. So, air convergence near the surface that supplies a lot of fresh oxygen to the fire. Obviously, that's something that we know is part of the fire triangle. You need sufficiently abundant oxygen for combustion to occur at a high intensity. So by virtue of all the upward moving air, conservation of mass tells us, well, I mean, you don't live in a vacuum, and the air's got to come from somewhere, and it can't come vertically up from the ground, of course. So it's got to run inward from the sides. So you have convergence where the fire is that's supplying it with both oxygen and sometimes gusty winds that can push the flames as well. And then the last thing that can happen is you can actually get really what I would call the most exotic fire behavior of all, which are in some cases in the lesser form they're called fire whirls, but in the most extreme iteration under a pyrocumulonimbus cloud in a semi-organized way, what effectively becomes a fire tornado, a pyrovortex. And
Hmm.
I think in decades past some folks, including some fire scientists, might have, or and meteorologists, would have thought that was a bit of an exaggeration. Is it really a tornado, or is it just sort of a random spin up along the boundary? And we certainly do see these lesser spin ups. They're more like dust devils. They can still be a problem if you're a firefighter on the fire line. They can cause embers to jump over the line. They can, blow out your window in a firefighting vehicle, but they're not the extreme towering inferno that fire tornado suggests. But as it turns out, when you get a pyrocumulonimbus cloud that begins to rotate like a supercell thunderstorm, the same kind of process that generates regular tornadoes in Tornado Alley or something, you can actually generate a legitimate fire tornado, essentially a column of flames, sometimes flames that are burning at 1,000 or 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, a continuous cone with winds that can exceed 150 miles an hour. So it is quite literally a tornado of fire. And studies have suggested there have been at least three or four major California wildfires since 2010 that have generated uh, legitimate pyro tornadoes, including the one on the Carr fire near Redding,
Hmm.
that killed people and caused damage to people's homes, even homes that didn't burn by virtue of the extreme winds.
Yeah.
So there's a wide range, and that, of course, that's at the upper end of the intensity spectrum, but it just goes to show you that, you know, wildfires of a certain intensity, when conditions are right, they really can generate their own weather conditions and not just localized winds, but up to and including, legitimate severe thunderstorm type behavior.
Yeah. I've heard that from friends who were there, colleagues that were there at the Creek Fire in the Sierra.
Yep, that was one of them.
That was another one where they reported right at the beginning of the fire some sort of tornado event that just blew everybody away, literally, I guess. Um, about the lightning strikes that can happen is I've read that there was something happened like that during what was the line fire in Southern California, where it started creating a lot of lightning strikes. Do you recall that one?
Yeah, that was one of them. Although, frankly, there have probably been dozens of California fires in the last decade and a half that have generated their own lightning. That has actually become, I wouldn't call it common, but it also isn't rare. And there have been some wildfires up in British Columbia in the last 5 or 10 years, actually, we've measured that have generated hundreds of thousands of lightning strikes, um, which is kind of mind-boggling. I mean, that is a
Hmm.
massive volume of lightning to the point where, especially in remote, densely forested areas, so this actually happens a lot in the remote Intermountain West, or maybe even more so in the boreal forests of Canada, or even Siberia in Russia, where there's, hundreds or even thousands of miles of largely contiguous flammable coniferous forests that, in the summer can get quite warm and dry and flammable and is very susceptible to these large, high intensity fires that can produce a lot of lightning. You get these fire complexes that can spread over dozens or hundreds of miles even, and they become essentially their own engines of combustion. They're just starting dozens and dozens of new fires by virtue of their own intensity, and they just hopscotch across the landscape. It's difficult for a single fire to move hundreds of miles across the landscape if it's just translating linearly, burning contiguously from point A to point B. But it's a lot easier if this fire, on multiple afternoons generates these these cumulonimbus clouds that are producing copious lightning strikes, where each strike can potentially be a new 5 or 10 mile extent ahead of the previous one. You can see how all of a sudden it really only takes 5 or 10 days like that to produce hundreds of miles of fire spread, because each individual spot fire under those conditions, can move a couple of miles before sparking a new one 5 or 10 miles upwind.
Yeah. What about the wind directions? Can there be wind going in the downward direction from these things, like downbursts?
Yeah, that's another problem that we see with these intense fires that produce pyrocumulus or pyrocumulonimbus clouds is you can get very gusty and erratic winds, even if there's no fire whirls, no fire vortex. A more common thing to happen is you get um, a convection column that is in steady state for a while. So, a fire burning in a particular spot at fairly high intensity, say it's moving through a forest, a cluster of, beetle-killed pine trees or something, a few hundred acres of it. And then it moves into a meadow and it's still burning, but the fuel and the literal amount of biomass suddenly decreases by a factor of 100 or 1,000, and the fire is burning, but the actual thermal intensity of the fire decreases suddenly. Now you might not have as much thermal intensity to maintain that convection column, and so you start to develop a weakening of the updraft, and some of that air, depending on the level of buoyancy, can sort of start to fall back toward ground level. And sometimes there's a restoring force that just lets it bounce around in the mid levels. So there's kind of think of it like a spring oscillator where the midpoint is 10,000 feet up, and you kind of have extended it above the midpoint, and then it rapidly falls back to the ground, then it starts slowing down before it hits the ground. Sometimes it slows down completely, but sometimes if the collapse is rapid enough, that downward rushing air doesn't necessarily have time to fully slow down before it hits the ground. You can get a pretty strong downdraft. And this is true of ordinary thunderstorms too. So it's not necessarily unique about wildfires, but sometimes the effect of the pyrocumulonimbus clouds over a wildfire can be even more erratic because, again, they're being supplied by a very localized discontinuous heat source. So if you temporarily choke it off, then you can get all sorts of weird behavior and downdrafts, and this can be really dangerous, primarily for firefighters because those are the people who are deliberately in near the fire front or in potential harm's way. I mean, ideally, other people have evacuated by that point. Although again, if it's a fast-moving fire, especially if it's the relatively early stages of one, it can also affect people who are still in the risk zone. But this can be a big problem because it interferes with the ability of aircraft to respond effectively. Since, imagine trying to fly in a 60, 70 mile an hour downdraft with the wind trying to push you into the closer to ground level, especially if you're only flying a few hundred feet off the deck in a retardant dropping aircraft or something. That's a no-no. So it means that you can't fly necessarily the firefighting aircraft. It can cause fires to jump over fire lines. It can cause the fire to change direction suddenly, which can be dangerous if you have wildland fire crews on the ground, because they're potentially exposed to that. So these are all things that the coordinators of these firefighting efforts have to think about, and there are usually meteorologists on staff, or hopefully on site during big fire events to guide the fire folks through this. But a lot of times it's also, a question of just eyes on the ground or eyes in the air. And there's usually an air attack aircraft, so not a retardant dropping plane, but just essentially a supervisory crew that's literally keeping an eye on things and looking out for specifically these kinds of hazards and trying to radio down to ground crews, if and when they see something that looks concerning. And that's a really important role that we don't hear about it as much. It's not as visually dramatic as the big retardant drops along the ridge lines, but it's actually a very important role for the safety of firefighters and for the safety of people who might need to evacuate.
Yeah, those living on the wildland urban interface, right? And this is all so amazing. And and incredible for us to learn and then to see in real time when you broadcast. Hey, I just wanted to I hope you'd indulge us a little bit here because I want to shift a little bit and talk about September 2020 and the Orange Sky Day that everybody in the Bay Area where I live um, remembers with a certain amount of um, amazement and horror, really, that the sky turned the way it did. And that was during the North Complex fire, right? That was, and particularly the Bear Fire. Um, can you enlighten us a little bit about how that all happened and why the sky turned the way it did?
Yeah, so 2020 was quite the year in many ways, but among them, wildfire in California included, and in particular that period from August to September 2020 in California and all along the West Coast when there was that huge, we call it a lightning bust, where hundreds, literally hundreds of wildfires were ignited over about a 12-hour period in Northern California due to that incredible dry lightning storm, sort of with the almost no precipitation, thousands of lightning strikes, and winds that gusted up to 75 miles an hour. I mean, imagine, worse fire conditions than that during a near historically severe drought. I can't quite imagine ones that would be worse. And then it's early September around Labor Day we had these strong offshore winds that then blew up a bunch of these extant lightning ignited fires from a couple of weeks earlier and caused them to make really big runs, in some cases in really densely forested areas. And the Bear Fire or the Bear Complex Fire, it was originally a couple of different lightning ignited fires that actually ended up merging together because essentially there were no firefighting resources to fight them at all in the initial hours because they were so occupied with the literally dozens to hundreds, depending on which day we're talking about, of other fires that were burning. And so this was a fire that burned up in the higher foothills, lower mountains initially, and then it moved down slope up in northeastern California, where there's really dense mix of forest, including some forest plantations, which, as we've learned, are actually in a lot of cases these commercial forestry plantations are significantly more flammable than even a very dense, more natural forest burning through these at an incredible velocity and rate of speed. And by velocity, I mean this fire moved like 20 miles over the course of hours. It was unbelievably fast fire, and it produced a lot of the behavior we're talking about. There were pyrocumulonimbus events, there were downdrafts, there was probably some lightning. I don't recall exactly, but this combination of factors and the drought allowed, and the wind that day allowed that fire to make an incredible, like 250,000 acre run in essentially one day. That's an unbelievable rate of spread for a forest fire. It would be fast for a grass fire, which typically moves faster than a forest fire, but for this to be burning in an essentially contiguous coniferous forest, just an unbelievable amount of biomass was consumed over a short period of time and turned into soot, ash, and smoke, essentially. So all of that, a huge multi tens of mile swath of Northern California forest was aerosolized over the course of like 12 hours. That's one sort of crude way to think about it, but in effect, that's essentially what happened. And the reason I phrase it like that was that it added to the already large volume of smoke that was in the air from all the other fires that were burning. So it would have been a big deal if that was the only fire, but of course there were dozens of others, including some that were still burning in the Bay Area and in the North Bay. And on that day, the I guess we can call it the Great Orange uh, Smoke Day in the Bay Area, I think was in some ways the thing that freaked people out the most was the fact were the optical effects of the smoke that day. And interestingly, it wasn't the same everywhere you were. The really eerie deep orange glow that lasted most of the day in San Francisco and in a lot of the surrounding Bay Area was actually in some ways visually striking but less dramatic than what happened further to the north. There were parts of the North Bay and the Central Valley that woke up in the morning, um, with their usual alarm and then found that the sun didn't rise that day at all, and the nighttime streetlights stayed on. It was essentially midnight black at 9, 10, 11 a.m., and then noon came, and people were really kind of unnerved by the fact that the sun still hadn't risen at noon. At least that's how it felt under this incredibly dense smoke plume. And so up there, under the core part of the plume, where it was densest, where that 250,000 acre of coniferous forest was essentially in the air above your head, uh, the smoke was so deep and so dense that it essentially resulted in what we would call the near extinction of visible light from the sun, even during daytime. So the smoke was essentially so dense that the smoke particles between the top of the smoke plume and the surface where we live was absorbing virtually all of the visible light from the sun. So
Mhm.
at night, of course, we it's dark because we're not facing the sun and there is no sunlight because the sunlight's hitting the other side of the earth. In this situation, the sun was still obviously there above the smoke, and if you'd been up at 30 or 40,000 feet, it would have been a sunny day. But beneath the smoke plume, it was so dense that it really wasn't letting any light through at all. And there were people who were sending messages to me saying it felt like the end of the world because the sun never rose that day in far northern California. But in the Bay Area, it was a bit of a different story. Believe it or not, the dramatic effect there was because the smoke was somewhat less dense, but still present throughout almost the entire atmospheric column. So this comes down to an interesting quirk of atmospheric optics. It's not necessarily because the contents of the smoke that day were unusual. In fact, it was in a lot of ways it was very typical of a major wildfire. It was mostly aerosolized organic matter, carbon from burning trees. But what was different was both the total volume and the vertical distribution of the smoke. So there was somewhat less dense smoke over the Bay Area. So it wasn't blocking out all light from the sun. It was dim, so it was blocking out some of the light. So there was maybe only 50 or 60% of the usual amount of sunlight. So it was definitely dim, but also, you could see your hand in front of your face. It wasn't pitch black. But what did happen, and what happens sometimes when these deep smoke plumes occur, is that essentially the size of the smoke particles was such that there was a differential scattering of light. In particular, the bluer hues, the shorter wavelengths of light from the sun at the top of the atmosphere were all getting scattered more near the top of the smoke plume to the point that by the time that sunlight reached the ground, there wasn't a lot of blue light left, the shorter wavelength light, and what was left were the oranges and reds, the longer wavelengths. That's the sunlight that was making it through and was reaching our eyes. It was kind of like a similar effect to why when the sun is low on the horizon, so sunrise and sunset, even on an ordinary day, so there tend to be more red and orange hues in the atmosphere because that arc of sunlight low on the horizon has to travel through a thicker atmospheric air mass. The limb angle is, I guess, longer, and so you have more scattering again of that blue light away from you. And so what's left by the time that light gets to your eyes is more of these oranges and reds. Essentially, what happened was that smoke column acted like a perpetual sunset for that whole day and resulted in this eerie orange glow where everything was dim. So, a lot of the shorter wavelengths of light just weren't making it through at all. And what was left was essentially this eerie orange glow. And that was amplified by the fact that it actually got so cold that day. You may remember it was not a hot day despite this active fire because so much sunlight was being blocked, it got cold near the surface, and there was actually a bit of fog condensation, and the smoke was acting as cloud condensation nuclei. So what was happening was the blue light wasn't making it through, the red and oranges were left, but also the red and oranges that were there were reflecting off of a sparse fog within the smoke plume. So it was kind of a smoke fog day, and all you could see was this glow. So there's a lot of complex atmospheric optics going on a day like this, and your experience, probably varied depending on where you were in Northern California. But all in all, it was a very disconcerting day either way because either the sun never rose and you were driving around at noon in essentially midnight darkness, or you were in the Bay Area and it kind of looked like Blade Runner 2047 skies.
Yeah, yeah, it's a day most of us will never forget, you know, and because we thought it would burn off like anything usually burns off, you know, by mid-afternoon. Thought it was related to fog initially, you know, but then it didn't. And the air quality, as I recall, you know, I mean, it smelled of smoke, but it wasn't like the worst air quality near the surface. It was, but you know, it was bad, but you could still breathe. And it was just looking up. It was just such a crazy color that just continued all day long. Yeah, something we'll never forget, and should have been a wake up call for everything we're trying to do to mitigate things like this. And so, hey, the last topic I wanted to ask you about, and thank you, that was a fantastic description of everything that happened during that week. Um, I guess you know the big long term question, and I won't ask it in a any other way but to say, when you look at future predictions of how the climate might change in California, from climate models and so forth, is there anything that particularly concerns you about climate predictions and fires going forward, that really stands out, you know, in the overall scheme, from humidity to precipitation to wind, all those things as you look forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, the real theme, obviously, and this is not going to come as a surprise, but it's already warmer than it used to be in California, and it's going to be warmer still moving forward. And so, but within that, it's really everything beyond temperature that's maybe more interesting and more relevant, which is that we know that extreme fire weather conditions have become a lot more extreme due to the warming that we've seen. And it's not just because temperatures are warmer, it's also because what's known as the vapor pressure deficit, the gap between how much moisture could be in the atmosphere at a given temperature and how much is actually present, has greatly increased. And interestingly, this is another thing that doesn't necessarily have to do with relative humidity. The relative humidity could have stayed exactly the same, but in a warming world, that vapor pressure deficit, that absolute humidity gap, would be increasing regardless. And we know that this drives more intensive potential evaporation from the soil, from bodies of water, and also potentially from many plant species, which has direct relevance for wildfire. And what it means is that even if we don't see a decrease in the average amount of precipitation, it means that the driest dry periods are getting drier, and they will continue to be drier still moving forward, which means that it's going to be easier for the landscape to dry out to extremely or even historically dry levels, even when precipitation isn't necessarily at historically low levels. And so it's essentially a cheat code for the atmosphere to steal more moisture from plants in the landscape. And the problem is, had we been living in a region where that was already the norm, we would have plant species and landscapes that were essentially adapted to that. And they might still be fire prone, but they would largely be in equilibrium. But here again, the problem is rapid change. We have species that are adapted to past millennia. Trees and grasses and shrubs live where they do because that's the distribution of climate conditions and landscape conditions that allowed them to thrive historically and prehistorically in those places. But now we got plants growing in places that are out of alignment with their preferred climate, and this is going to be one of the challenges in a warming world, is that the rapid pace of change is much greater than, we're not seeing forests migrate dozens of miles per year. There's no physical way they can get up and walk away. And so with each passing decade, our landscapes are more out of alignment with the climate conditions in which they evolved. And so in many cases, they're becoming more flammable because precisely for that reason. And the other thing we know is that the variability of California's hydroclimate, which is already high, they swings between wet and dry season to season. I mean, just think about our seasonality. We have consistently dry summers and wet winters, so we already have a lot of seasonal swings from one season to the next, more so than most other places in North America, in fact. But we expect that those swings seasonally and from year to year are going to grow even more profound. So even if we don't see huge changes in our average precipitation, and we haven't thus far, believe it or not, despite everything else we've seen, the average amount of precipitation in California is not greatly changed despite much warmer temperatures and despite much drier dry extremes. So, how does that math pencil out? Well, it must mean that the wettest wets are either staying the same or getting even wetter. So, what we expect to see essentially is wider swings between extreme wet and extreme dry, increasing hydroclimate whiplash, is what I would call it. And that
Yep.
leads to some good and bad things in context. One is it means that it's unlikely we're going to just stop seeing precipitation. So, from a water supply perspective, the water will still come, which is better than it not arriving at all, but it's going to come in increasingly inconveniently timed intense bursts. So, more variability, meaning it's harder to capture, and also meaning that in the in between phases, when it is really dry, it will be drier than it used to be. But during the wetter periods is when we see all of our vegetation growth. And that's sort of the cycle we're back in right now in Northern California. The last few years, there have been some notable fires, but nothing compared to 2020 or 2018 or 2017 or even 2016, which were extremely active fire years. And that's partly because we've been much wetter, not necessarily much cooler. It's still been among the warmest years on record in Northern California, but it hasn't been super dry. We're not in a severe multi-year drought right now, which has helped forests recover, which is good. And we have reasonably good water supply in the reservoirs right now, thanks to that relatively favorable weather we've had the last few years. But of course, the challenge is in a warming climate, what that means is that a lot of our recent wildfire burn footprints are filling in with regrown vegetation. And of course, we don't want them to remain bare forever. I don't think that's what anyone wants to see. So it's good that they are filling in, but what it means though is that this alternating cycle with warmer but also increasingly wide swings between wet and dry means that we get worse fires during the dry periods, and then we get this sort of vegetation regrowth and recharge supercharged during the wet periods in between. And so we're already at a point, here in 2026 where even though this year doesn't necessarily look like it's an obviously a precursor to a bad fire season in the sense of there isn't a severe long-term drought, we've already filled in a lot of those footprints from 2020. So we've talked a lot about that September 2020 event. We've now had 5 or 6 years of regrowth, and a lot of those fire footprints could sustain another high intensity or wind-driven fire under the right conditions. And I don't think we have those conditions right now, fortunately, but the next time that they arise, you know, these are places that could burn again and pose
Yeah.
problems. And so we're kind of stuck in this cycle right now. And one of the things that I'm hoping that we take really seriously is that most towns and cities in California have some exposure to wildfire, whether it's on their fringes or whether it's the whole town. There's some risk there in most spots. And thinking about how we can build those communities and all the way from the individual structure level up to county and state level to be more resilient to the fires we know will come is really one of the big immediate challenges we face right now. And although we can't single-handedly affect the trajectory of climate change, we can't prevent extreme fire weather conditions from happening. We do have some say over what happens once these fires reach our neighborhoods, and I'm hoping that's where we can make some real progress.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I live in a community here on the peninsula, just south of San Francisco, and um, while we do feel, somewhat helpless with the weather, there's starting to be a lot of activity by our local county fire departments and the open space preserve areas that are owned by public or private, but entities that can conduct prescribed burns, control burns on those areas, and try to get rid of a lot of the fire fuel that's on the ground, that can lead up to a ladder up into the upper canopy. So there's increasing awareness that controlling and doing control burns, and in the state parks along the coast, pile up their dead and down branches, and they burn them in little teepees, and and each state park is now burning over 100 of those a season around this time. So there are some things we can do to be more proactive and reduce fuels, and that's starting to happen, and starting to budget for it. So our don't we don't have to feel completely helpless going forward that way. We can protect the wildland urban interface. But hey, Professor Swain or Dr. Swain, thank you so much for spending the time with us today. We're about at the limit, and you've given us so much to think about and to learn about. And so thanks again for your time today during this relatively quiet period. But when the next one comes, we'll be tuning into that YouTube channel, I'm sure, and seeing what's going on, and listening to your play-by-play, because no one does it better. So thank you so much for spending the time with me today.
Thanks again for having me.
Yeah, great. Good luck and stay safe down there in Southern California, and we'll try to do the same here in Northern. So take care.